Hey bookworms, welcome back to my channel, or welcome generally if that's your first time watching. I am back after some time away and I want to thank all of you for your patience and bearing with me. I explained in my last video that I got a little overwhelmed from all the things going on in my life, and I don't want to put out content without actually having a content to do. Also, those of you who are following me on Instagram saw that my amazing, beloved, wonderful, one-of-a-kind cat, Cookie, passed away not too long ago. And to say that I was broken, still broken by this, is an understatement. And after it happened, I obviously didn't feel like reading, much less filming, editing, and uploading videos. But now I'm back with a few videos planned. Let's hope everything goes smoothly from now on. But I am only human. Speaking of being human and loved ones dying, I guess, let's talk Stephen King. Considering I lost Cookie, would have been appropriate somewhat if I was talking about Pet Sematary, but no. Today I will be reviewing one of King's favorite books that he wrote, Salem's Lot, which was written in the 70s and is one of his earliest books. Now, Salem's Lot takes place in the titular town, whose full name is actually Jerusalem's Lot, and we mainly follow Ben Mears, an author who grew up in Salem's Lot and came back after years of living in a big city, only to discover that he's not the only new face in town and that the mysterious people who are residing in the Lot's local haunted house might be vampires. So I liked this book. In the past, when it came to Stephen King, I either absolutely loved his books or absolutely hated them. But recently I found a middle, and this is one of those cases. Not to say anything bad about this book, I'll get to the negatives later, but this is a solid horror novel. It's a modern twist, you know, modern, it's the 70s, but modern compared to the 19th century. Anyway, it's a modern twist on both the vampire genre and kind of also the haunted house genre. There is an underlying, almost subplot kind of sorta about the house itself and how it's evil. The book also aged really well. I had to remind myself sometimes that it takes place in the 1970s, as I was wondering why didn't people use their cell phones to call for help or record stuff. And as always, the main thing, the heart of Stephen King's books is always the characters. And here we have a bunch of people teaming together to stop these evil vampires. And it's these characters who are so different from each other, each bringing something else to the team and each lovable, sometimes due to their flaws, that made the book for me. So this information might be enough for you, but if you want some more, let's get into more details. Let's start with the positives. I already talked about the characters, and I don't want to get into too much details because I don't want to reveal to you who survives long enough to make it to the final warrior group, but I'll just mention again that writing interesting, compelling characters who are far from perfect is maybe my favorite King strength. I really love the humanity of the characters, how despite being brave and determined, they were also scared and unsure at times. In addition, I love how each character reacts differently to the notion that vampires exist. The doctor reacts like a scientist, the teacher like a scholar reading books about the subject. It was a nice touch. Also, I loved how King tried to set the vampire lore into modern reality, so you have characters deciding how to put a stake into a vampire's heart, but then what? What do you do with a body? How do you explain to the police that you aren't a cold-blooded murderer but actually killed a monster that technically was already dead? Speaking of the characters, this brings up a concept I really like in Stephen King's books. We all know he writes horror, almost always supernatural one. However, what many people skip out on is the fact that for every Pennywise, ghosts, and demons, there are always human villains. Many times the supernatural villain in King's books is rather generic. They are simply a force of evil. But the real interesting thing is that there is always a human villain. The real people are the real evil. However, here it's a little different. You have some mean people, some assholes that I was wondering whether they will turn out to be the real big bad. But the bottom line is that here, the vampires are the villains. However, remember that vampires used to be humans. That's the emotional difficulties with vampires, zombies, werewolves. They are evil monsters, but they used to be alive, used to be someone's friend, spouse, child. So despite it being too early in King's career to be called a twist on a trope, having read many of his later works, I thought this concept was interesting considering how much stress he puts on it's the human, the regular people who are the real villains in his books. I also like the way vampires were portrayed and their characteristics, what happens to them at daylight, how they react to crosses, how they need to get permission to enter houses, and how exactly does the process of turning into a vampire works. It seems like King really took his research seriously because vampire lore is famous, but still different from one book to another. So he really tried to create a full, comprehensive look at the vampires. But this actually leads me to the negatives, because despite the book being kind of grounded in reality, as much as a fantasy horror book about undead fantastic creatures can be, I also felt that at the same time it leans on somewhat faulty logic. First off, despite all characters needing convincing that vampires exist, I did feel that at the same time some of them were convinced way too easily or without proper proof. Second, I felt that the characters jump into conclusions about the source of the evil too quickly. They reach the conclusion that the evil is something, let's say, from pop culture very easily. But what made them so sure that the rules from Dracula and Carmilla and folklore apply to these creatures? What if they do suck people's blood, but they don't react at all to holy objects? Or they become less strong at the daytime, but that's the extent of its effect on them? They researched something that was never actually scientifically researched. Some of it is from fiction, and they are obviously completely correct in every assumption they made. It just felt a little too easy. Also, not on the same level, but I do want to point out that this book had 3 characters named Matt, Mark, and Mike, and I kept getting confused as to whom is who. Sorry, Steven, but if you can come up with characters called Royal and Nolly, you can come up with some characters' names that don't begin with the letter M. Just wanted to point that out. But going back, there are 2 last things I want to point out regarding the negatives. The first is that this is a Stephen King book and suffers from the regular King stuff, like being very blabbery and also very sexual in the most inappropriate times, like a woman rushing to save her dying baby, and he describes how her dressing gown opens and exposes her. And lastly, without getting into too much details, I did not like the ending. Not the conclusion of how and if the evil was defeated, but the way King chose to end the book. It went on for way too long. There is an interesting flash forward, which I'm okay with. It was interesting to see how things looked in the future, but the way we left the heroes is weird, and also there is a 100+ pages of an epilogue. What the fuck? After the entire plot ended, we get pages on pages of diary entries from the 19th century in Salem's Lot, and this is some kind of an origin story, but it felt so wrong. First, it was a completely different story that belonged in a different book. Second, it didn't really give us anything. So now we know what happened before and kind of the origin of things, kind of. So what? These are vampires. They are evil and have been living for hundreds of years. We don't need to know exactly which family brought them to where and how. So to conclude, this is a pretty good horror novel and a must if you're a Stephen King fan. The negatives are mostly the regular problems King has, what I like to call the Stephen King ADHD, where he would just start going on and on about random things. But for the most part, it was better than I thought. One of the best vampires books ever? Not really. One of King's best novels? Also, not for me, but I also hated The Shining, so maybe I'm not a good example. But that was it for my review on Salem's Lot. Guys, thank you so much for watching and for bearing with me while I was MIA. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and make sure to click the little bell icon so you won't miss any new upload. Also, write me a comment saying if you are a Stephen King fan and what is your favorite novel by him. Again, guys, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.